So I'm not superstitious, but I heard there was thunder outside when this paper on economic development and democracy and clean elections more in particular was about to be presented. So this is a collaborative project with a lot of co-authors all sitting in this room. And the title Economic Development Leads to Clean Elections relates to a more specific result that I'm going to present to you. But let me first start with the background. So as Thomas Carruthers also alluded to in this talk, there's quite a lot of debate, both in policy circles and in academia, and it's been going on for several decades, on whether it's possible to promote democracy in poor country contexts. So is it the case that getting and obtaining democracy is easier, much easier in rich countries than in poor countries? And I think the consensus answer, although there are nuances, we are of course political scientists debating this, so there are different opinions, but the general answer to this was, well, yes, if you are richer, it's much easier to get and obtain democracy. And until recently, at least, that was kind of the standard answer. So in the last few years, there have been a few studies who have thrown some great deal of doubt on this result. Is it actually the case? So can poor countries as easily as rich countries get and obtain democracy? And this doubt, now you heard both John and Staffan talking about causality and time series, so they've kind of stolen my thunder, and I'm not going to go into the technicalities of this. But this graph here, which I've stolen from a paper by Asimov et al., which is one of the key studies in this literature, shows why this previous consensus was so prevalent. So as you go along this x-axis, you have the richer countries. And along the y-axis, the more democratic countries. And you can see that the richer the countries are, typically they're also more democratic. So this is kind of the underlying notion. Richer countries are more democratic. But these recent studies have been looking more closely at developments over time, and you actually find a very different result. So as countries grow richer, it's not very clear whether they're becoming more or less democratic. So the relationship here, over time, is not very clear. So one interpretation could be that it's simply other things. It's culture, it's geography, it's political history that makes it such that Sweden is both very democratic and rich, and for instance, Afghanistan has generally been poor and autocratic. So we don't really know any longer. This is an important question. So we wanted to use V-Dem data to really dig into this. So, of course, V-Dem is all about the varieties of democracy and different aspects of democracy. And I think this is one of the true benefits of these data. So what we're saying is, well, there are these different aspects of democracy. And it's not clear that economic development should impact on, say, elections and civil society organizations in the same manner. There may be very different effects. So we wanted to disentangle this and investigate whether economic development leads to some aspect of democracy, but not others. And our findings are pretty clear and perhaps a bit surprising. So we find that economic development is indeed strongly related to one very important aspect of democracy, and that's the electoral aspect. And I'll be more specific in a minute. But also, and this is an important null finding, perhaps not as, yeah. So the other aspects of democracy are not as clearly related to economic development. So civil liberties, for instance. We don't find a clear effect that when income increases, civil liberties increase. We only find it on the electoral aspect in an unequivocal fashion, where we can really be certain that there is an effect. And this is also then based on changes within countries over time. So to be more specific, what we do find is that when income increases, when countries become richer, we see less election violence, less government intimidation, and to Staffan's big concern, less vote buying, and less electoral fraud. So this is what happened when countries get richer. And we think there are some very good reasons for this, which we elaborate on in our theoretical argument. So one reason is that when the economy develops, when you're a politician in the United States, it's not as dramatic to exit office. You have good options. You can go into the private sector. Same here in Scandinavia. So a developed economy offers alternative. And elections are, of course, critical because if you lose them, you lose power. In a poor country, that may be very dramatic in a rich country, maybe not as dramatic, and you can more easily allow for clean elections. The other thing is looking at the power relationships between citizens and leaders. So the other argument, and I won't go into depth on this, but as the economy develops, citizens get relatively more resourceful, relatively more powerful as opposed to the leaders, and can more effectively challenge them in different ways. Right, so drawing policy implications of this is of course a dangerous sport, but we're trying to be tough. And one of them relates to this negative finding. So we didn't find any very strong relationship between income and these other aspects of democracy. So if our results are true, it means that it shouldn't be significantly much harder to promote civil society organizations or improve on civil liberties aspects in poorer countries than in richer countries. Everything else hold constant, everything else equal. So income shouldn't matter. Promoting clean elections is more difficult. Leaders in poor countries are going to make this very tough, right? So should we just give up? We don't think so. And it's not just wishful thinking, but if you actually look at our argument, some of the reasons why we think these are linked relate to the power resources of individuals, but also to the alternatives that leaders have. And these are things that can be manipulated. So you can promise, for instance, African leaders sums of money if they voluntarily exit office. So you can try to manipulate these very difficult things and thus achieve clean elections also in poor countries. Okay.